On behalf of the Killorglin Archive Society Decade of Centenaries Committee, I want to welcome you all here this afternoon now. It was left to local groups, clubs, societies to commemorate aspects of the Decade of Centenaries, and we have decided to commemorate the Kerry team of the 1920s, their achievements both on and off the field. And I want to, in particular, to welcome Dr Richard McElligott, who will deliver the paper. I want to welcome Father Tom Looney of Killorglin, himself an authority in Kerry GA, and he has very kindly agreed to chair this lecture here today. I want to welcome members of some of the players who played at that time who are here today. We have Conor Brosnan and Mike Brosnan, who will be grandsons of the great Con Brosnan. And we have Eddie Barrett and Johnny Barrett. Eddie is a nephew of the great Joe Barrett, who was back at that team, and Johnny will be grandson. And we have Gerald Landers, who is the son of Bill Landers and nephew of Purty Landers and Roundy Landers, who played at that time. So without further ado now, I'm going to hand you over to Father Looney, who will run the show first. Okay, Father.
Nigel Nila Falsha, Don Chakla Kayla Shaw, and Hanona Kashlana, Victeshudding, Harga, Matnava Studair, Ian, Courses, Taroil there, Sport and Strife, the Civil War and the Rise of Kerry's greatest football team. That's the title put on it now by the local committee here, and I praise them and laud them for their thoughtfulness and for their plans, not just for today, but into the coming months as well. So on behalf of the Killorglin Archive Society, I reached Kate Falsha during this decade of centenaries, when Jerome Conway catches you behind the stand in the Aston Park and says, will you do such and such a day? You can't say no to Jerome. He's that kind of a man because he's a giver himself. So Jerome will ask me for Christmas and Tommy and Shaw. It was to be on tonight at 8 o'clock, but I think we're otherwise booked. Is that right? I told Dr Richard, and I brought the new jet to Jerome there at Curlin's. Following Dr Richard's talk and lecture, and will be illustrated, of course, because he is a gifted communicator and a marvellous teacher, we will introduce some of the family members, maybe I thought, in case there be civil war again, in alphabetical order. So the Barretts and the Brosnans, is that okay? And then we'll have the Landers and the Looneys. Now Brian she wants to be here. Brian sent his apology last evening, but he's very much with us here in spirit. He had intended to come represent the Sheehy family, but there are a lot of people here from Mitchell's, I know. So after that, then there'll be questions and answers, and a screen you see there, a lovely programme mapped out, of Wish's profile on the captains. Richard himself is a Stacks Mountain man. He's more from the hurling country of Cratta, will that be right? But he said he was the worst hurler and footballer ever to come out in North Kerry. I wouldn't believe that, but we're lucky he's a brilliant historian, and he did his doctorate on this very topic, on this very theme. He calls it the story of the origins and development of the GA in Kerry through its vital first 50 years. I love the word, Richard, vital, first 50 years. I'll be getting on to his college shortly, maybe Jerome will and his committee here, and we might ask his present college, he's a UCD graduate and taught in UCD before going to Dundalk. I think we're going to ask the Dundalk authorities to grant him a sabbatical to write the next 50 years, well, to 2024, 2024. Would that be possible? So this is part one today. Well, it's just a section of part one, really. I've been rereading your work, absolutely brilliant. and it's not my first time working with Richard, and he's a very generous giver, by the way. Anybody interested in research, he promised me a book. I thought I'd never see it, and it came in the post with an apology for being late. But this book is unavailable, but Richard made a copy available for me, and that's the O'Sullivan's History of the GAA. So now, I have a book here I want to show you, because Dennis Healy, a man like yourself, very interested in GAA. Well, I showed you. This is the other side of Magneton Mountain, Dennis Healy, and he got on to me a few times about the poems, and 675 pages of ballads and recitations and poems about Kerry and Kerry sport, especially football, hurling as well, but mostly Kerry football. And a huge section devoted to this very period that Richard is leading us today. And by the way, if you haven't seen Richard's book, and I recommend it strongly, there it is, and it's available, of course, still, as we used to say, in all good bookshops. And we used to say, what's a good bookshop? So that's Richard's book, his doctoral thesis. So I'll read a verse that Dennis has published. It was in 1924 Orlando final. And some of your family here today were involved in that very match. And this verse goes as follows. Let not politics divide you, when the foe lie up beside you, very deep that piercing hatchet that has rent our land in twain, let them hear the joyful tidings that time has brought us victory in its long and dreary train. Now that was written and published in the Kerryman in 1924. Very deep that piercing hatchet. So I give you Dr. Richard how that hatchet was better.
Thanks, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Pleasure to be here in the Untitled Chapter. I just want to begin by sincerely thanking Jerome, Conway, Fiona Brennan, and basically everyone involved here in the Killorglin Archive Society for inviting me to talk to you all today. I think they've put together, it's going to be a really great event, and I just hope my talk is worthy of the occasion. Thanks also, of course, to the great Father Tom Looney for those very kind words of introduction. I think anyone who knows him knows that Father Tom is really one of this country's great historians himself, and I only wish I had attended to the knowledge this man has of Kerry history and of course Kerry football. So to get to it, I suppose, look, we're into the second month of 2022, and I guess we're getting into the home straight now of this island's decade of commemorations. But maybe the most difficult part of it all is yet to come, because, you know, in just 4 short months from now, we're going to be marking the 100th anniversary of what was really a traumatic conflict, which left an abiding mark on a nation that had just been born. Now we all know about that conflict here in Kerry, and the bitterness, the trauma, and the poisonous legacy it left behind. And I think how we, as a county and people, reflect on what happened in those dark months, how we choose to mark and commemorate it, and what lessons we'll look to take from it all, I think it'll tell us an awful lot. But my hope, anyway, is that we're now confident enough as a society, you know, 100 years removed from the event, to at least confront our past. That we don't take the routes of continuous silence or conscious disinterest or collective amnesia because we still think it's, you know, too emotive, too complicated, too recent a history. Instead, what I urge people to do is to simply understand what happened. Because this conflict, its causes and course and legacy, I think it's vital to understanding why this country developed in the way it did in the century that followed. And as part of all that, I'm here today really to talk about a rather exceptional group of young Kerrymen that emerged from that conflict. And it's an absolute honour to see some of their relatives and families here today. And again, I just hope my talk will do justice to their incredible story. So the second slide, please, if you don't mind. You've probably seen this. There's the great David Clifford modelling the commemorative jersey the Kerry GA produced last August. And I was delighted to be involved in some way in helping to create the jersey, and I suppose try and publicise the team, the Kerry team that tries to commemorate. Now look, I'll admit that for historians, this concept of commemorative jerseys is something a lot of us are still trying to understand, where it actually came from. Because I think for historians of this era, the Irish Revolutionary era, it's probably one of the most unusual byproducts of the huge and very welcome public interest in this era of our history. And look, there's no point pretending that some of the jerseys that have come out have been, I think, kind of cynical attempts at bandwagonism just to kind of enrich the coffers. That's probably most apparent in our dear neighbours Cork. Their attempt, you might see up there in 2019, it commemorates two obviously very prominent individuals, Cork men from the War of Independence. But the point I would make is they had absolutely no connection with the GA whatsoever. So I think it was a very cynical attempt to kind of cash in on the Revolutionary era. But in fairness, when O'Neill's approached the Kerry GA last spring about creating a potential jersey, it was a great credit to our county board that they got a group of people together who wanted to use this opportunity to actually commemorate what was a genuine GA story and a genuine GA history about a Kerry team that was born out of the still smouldering embers of the Civil War. One whose story over the following decade was truly remarkable and unique. They were, as you probably know, a team comprised from the opposing sides of the Civil War's ideological divide. Men who had fought and killed and suffered for what were their competing versions of an independent Irish state. Can you get the next slide, please? Yeah. So, you probably, if you've seen it, the team pictured on the jersey is, of course, the 1929 side. And that side actually comprised 7 Republicans, 1 serving Free State Army officer, 2 serving members from Garda Síochána, and another staunch Cumann na Gael supporter. Now, obviously coming from the place where the Civil War left its deepest wounds and its darkest memories, those young men now chose in the immediate aftermath to come together now and represent their county on the national stage. And because of that, and because of what they achieved, they helped, at least in some way, to atone for what this county had suffered in this squalid war between brothers and sisters, families, communities. And because of that and what they achieved, and I think for many people, I think their incredible success then on the national stage showcased the role the GA could play, both locally and nationally, in helping to heal the wounds and reconcile a society still traumatised by that conflict. And traumatised is a very apt word. Many of us here, I know the history of the Civil War in Kerry very well. But sometimes I think when you know a story well, you almost become desensitised to its reality and the impact it had on the people who lived through it. Thank you. And I hope the upcoming centenary commemoration will give this country the chance to truly understand the everyday impact and legacy of the Civil War. Because, again, to repeat, I would argue that no event in the whole decade of centenaries we are passing through, not the Easter Rising, not the War of Independence, actually shaped the history of the independent Irish state as much as the Civil War and what happened in those 18 months. Now look, by international standards, the conflict might seem like a trifling affair. We'll never have an accurate figure for the numbers killed, but its recent estimates reckon it to be something around 1,500 people. And of course, Kerry was not even the bloodiest county. Around 170 people died here compared to an estimated 220 in Cork and 258 in Dublin. But of course, what's most significant is not the quantity of bodies, but the brutal nature of so many of those killings. And I think that's most clearly illustrated by what occurred in Kerry in the spring of 1923. Because the last weeks of the war here were characterised by what were probably the worst atrocities of Ireland's entire revolutionary era. So, having suffered 3 deaths the day before, all of them Kerrymen, on the 6th of March, the National Army lost 5 more when a unit led by a local man, Lieutenant Patrick O'Connor, was tricked into approaching an IRA booby trap outside Donegal, which decapitated O'Connor and killed all but one of his comrades. And that survivor was actually a young Dublin private named Joseph O'Brien, and he was so horribly maimed he had to have both his legs amputated. And for years afterwards, tragically, the wife of his 3 young children would plead in vain to get the government he fought for to award him a proper army pension so he could at least have the dignity of affording a wheelchair for himself. Now, as we know, Donegal enraged the National Army Command in Kerry to such an extent that they now allowed the deaths of 22 IRA men then in army custody over the next few weeks. And of course, 17 of those men were killed in 3 separate and barbaric episodes over the next 5 days. at Ballyseedy, at Countess Bridge, and of course at Carsabeen. And so, the next slide, please. As you probably might know, before dawn on the 7th of March, 9 IRA prisoners, and remember these men had for days beforehand endured extensive torture in army custody, involved being beaten by a hammer while they were strapped to chairs. These men were now taken in a lorry from Trinity Barracks to the lonely Ballyseedy Wood, and then tied around a stone barricade that concealed the landmine. Miraculously, of course, one of them, Stephen Fuller, would survive the horror which followed. And at the age of 80, Fuller finally agreed to be interviewed about Ballyseedy, and it was actually the only time in his life he ever publicly spoke about that day. And as Fuller recalled, and I'm going to quote him here, they said they were going to blow us up with a mine. None of us said anything. The language they used was abusive language, it wasn't too good. One fella called us Irish bastards, but he was an Irishman himself. One of our lads asked if he let say prayers, and the fellow who was tying him with a rope hit him on top of the head and said, "No prayers. Our fellas didn't get any time for prayers." The soldiers moved away, but an officer stayed behind, and he took off our caps and said, "You can be praying away now, lads, as long as you like." So the next fellow to me said his prayers, and I said mine too. He said goodbye then, and I said goodbye. And the next lad picked it up and said, "Goodbye, lads, goodbye." Then up it went, and I went up with it, of course. Now, Fuller was somehow blown completely clear, and in the dark he managed to crawl to safety while he heard the soldiers moving to open fire on their comrades, who had survived the initial blast. Then their pulverized bodies were shoveled into coffins and brought back to Trinity Barracks. Now later that day, as rumours swept through town of what had occurred, a large crowd, including some members of some of the men's families, they assembled now outside Trinity Barracks, demanding those bodies be handed over. And as the soldiers passed the crude plank coffins through the gate, the army brass band actually came up behind them and began to play up-tempo jazz ragtime music. And you know, for all the horror of the actual events of something like Ballyseedy, I actually often dwell on that incident later, of a crowd of civilians growing hysterical in rage and grief, and this band there, representing the state's armed forces, seemingly delighting in the pain and suffering they had caused. And obviously all this amounts to what is premeditated murder by prisoners of representatives of an Irish government. And of course, a graphic illustration of that was the army commander in Kerry, General Penny Daly, who had warned his men from selecting the prisoners that they'd be all, quote, fairly anonymous, no priests or nuns in the family, those that will make the least noise. And of course, when men news surfaced that Fuller had survived Ballyseedy, the soldiers who presided over a similar execution of 5 IRA prisoners by another landmine outside Carsabeen, they made sure not only to tie the prisoners together, but to make sure they were all shot in the leg first, so that there could be no possibility of a repeatedness of another person escaping. And all of that is the painful and uncomfortable reality of what the Irish Civil War represented. Because on the one hand, you had a minority of diehards who felt justified waging a vicious war for an abstract political ideal. And yet, on the other side, you had a democratically elected Irish government that was willing to stand over the torture and ruthless execution of its citizens. Both sides, therefore, were capable of acts that left the actions of the British government during the War of Independence very much in the shade. And I think it's the close personal nature of the war that kind of fueled its bitter legacy. I mean, if you take my own native village of Killorglin, in 1920-1921, I might have had a population, I think, of about 70 people. But in the space of 1 month, 3 of its young men were killed in a sadistic fashion. George Shea and Timothy Toomey, they were among the dead of Ballyseedy. And then Timothy Errol Lyons, of course, was killed in highly controversial circumstances at the siege of Killorglin Caves. And so, in areas so geographically intimate, there was no family, there was no locality that was really left untouched by the cruel cycle of killings, reprisals, and violent retaliations, which now became everyday occurrences, not just in Kerry, but across much of Ireland during the Civil War. And of course, for the hundreds that died, there were the thousands left injured and scarred, either physically or psychologically, for the rest of their lives. And so, this was now an infant nation emerging in the knowledge of what its fellow citizens were capable of inflicting on each other. You know, there was no longer some foreign power or government to blame for all this. It now became a society where victors and vanquished continued to live at close quarters, and for the most part, now just pretended it never happened. or so we might like to believe. You know, we often hear the Civil War was never spoken about, and maybe openly that's true. But what I've always actually been fascinated by is that dynamic between the public silence and private preoccupation with the Civil War's legacy. Because veterans were very willing to talk about it to those they trusted. All you have to do is look at the interviews of the former IRA commander, Ernie O'Malley, those extensive interviews he conducted in later life with his fellow anti-treatyites in places like Kerry. And therefore, what I'm getting at here is the official end of military activity in May 1923, it could not end the bitterness, resentment, anger and sense of loss felt by communities all across Ireland. And in Kerry for decades to come, the legacy of the Civil War remained potent, poignant, and of course, poisonous. And not to depress you too much, but what I'm trying to illustrate just briefly is that's the essential backdrop to the history of this Kerry side. Because only 13 months after the events of Ballyseedy, they would make their first appearance when they played Cavan in Croke Park in the All-Ireland semi-final, I should say, of 1923. Now you have to remember, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the prospects of the Kerry footballers doing much in the next couple of years were not good. Many of their best players, of course, were Republicans who were either on the run at this stage or languishing in government internment camps. And so, drawn to play Limerick in the first round of the 1923 Munster final, it's reported only 2 players turned up in Tralee for the first practice match in the weeks leading up to that game. Yet, Kerry confounded the experts, going on to win the Munster title, beating a very fancy Tipperary side in the final, who had actually, Tipperary had only claimed in All-Ireland the year before. Now, the following spring, when most IRA prisoners now were released, the Kerry internees were very anxious to prove they had the beating of the new Munster champions. And so, on the 10th of February 1924, a challenge game, which more represented a political grudge match between the Republicans and the Free State personnel on that Kerry team, took place in what was said to be a quagmire in Tralee Sports Ground. No wonder, as you'll see up there, the Kerry Man report found the game to be, quote, robust and at times too much so, marred by large numbers of fouls, ensuring the referee was kept busy. And I've always admired the euphemism probably contained within those lines of what the match probably was like. Now, the match ended in a 4-point win for the Munster champions, and very much their pride dented. The attorneys requested a replay, trained especially hard, and this resulted in gaining a comfortable victory over the Kerry team, and obviously the Kerry selectors now took note. Therefore, it was a much changed Kerry side that ran onto the Croke Park pitch on a very wet April day against Cavan. It now included 9 of the ex-internees, like their new teeth-tough full-back Joe Barrett. Con Brosnan, a Serbian Free State Army captain, would now anchor the Kerry midfield, while up front, of course, was their star forward, John Joe, who of course was still on the run from the authorities. Now, this is Kerry's first appearance in Croke Park since 1919, and the Cork Examiner reported, you see it there, on entering, the Kerry team proceeded to the spot where Mick Hogan, the Tipperary player who was shot on Bloody Sunday. They now knelt in silent prayer on the faithful sod, while the spectators maintained a respectful silence. This action on Kerry's part was warmly appreciated by the crowd. As the Kerry team arose and walked back to the centre, the cheering was long and loud. And it seems very much, you get the impression from the records, that to the watching press and thousands looking on, it was the symbolism of that moment, that simple gesture of respect to the memory of a murdered Gael, which was very profound. As a team, they seem to have maybe not divided, but now arose united. Their unity now forged by their mutual respect for the Kerry jersey and all it represented. Now, the great historian J.J. Barrett, who sadly left us last summer, he did, of course, so much to bring the history of what was his father's team to light. And in his excellent book, In the Name of the Game, J.J. wrote, and I quote, that with this potent act, the healing process had begun, as he called it. Now, that's the Kerry team that eventually beat Cavan, but actually went down to Dublin by 2 points in the 1923 final that September. Yet, within 6 months, due to the backlog of matches and championships, those 2 opponents were now back to contest the 1924 All-Ireland final. A then record crowd of 30,000 travelled to see if Kerry could take home their first All-Ireland championship in more than a decade. And after what was reported to be a very tense and strenuous struggle, both sides were actually level at only 3 points apiece going into the final minutes, when Con Brosnan stepped up to coolly slot over a long-range free for Kerry's winning score. And that's the theme there. And that win, of course, kick-started what was truly a golden age for Kerry football. Over the next decade, this Kerry team won 10 Munster championships, 6 All-Irelands, of course including Kerry's first ever 4 in a row between 1929 and 32, and they also picked up 4 national leagues. Indeed, in league and championship, this Kerry team remained unbeaten in 34 consecutive games between October of 1928 and March 1933. And of course that record held until the Dubs managed to better it in 2017. And actually, only for the fact that no league competition was held in the 1930-31 season, Kerry's run of victories would surely have been even greater and probably never surpassed yet. Now, Kerry's dominance of the inter-county scene was also reflected in the fact that an old Kerry 15 captured 2 railway cups for Munster in 1927 and 1931. And of course, their international fame saw them conduct 3 high-profile tours of the United States in 27, 31, and again in 33. And of course, their rivalry at this stage with Kildare's last great All-Ireland winning team, this had such national appeal that the 4 finals they contested each saw record-breaking crowds, including an attendance of nearly 44,000 for the 1929 decider. And that was actually the first ever sporting event on this island to break the 40,000 attendance mark. So this was box office. The thing is, Kerry could and probably should have been even more dominant. You know, they were on course to comfortably retain their title in 1925 when Cavan, after losing the semi-final, lodged an objection to the legality of Phil O'Sullivan being allowed to play for Kerry. And this now set off a chain reaction of objections and counter-objections, which actually saw the All-Ireland being abandoned and Galway handed the title without Galway even qualifying for the All-Ireland final. Then in 1928, Tipperary beat them by a point in the Munster semi-final, a result acknowledged by the media at the time as being the greatest upset possibly in the entire history of the GAA. And of course, this Kerry team therefore made such a mark that they remained the most successful team in the history of the GAA until a certain other Kerry side surpassed them in 1985. And of course, to the watching nation, the unprecedented success of this politically divided team seems to have captured the imagination. You really get a sense of that when you look at the reporting on them at the time and what's said about them and written about them. And for many, they seem to embody sport's great potential to transcend the division and rancor in society still reeling from the Civil War. And you know, there's certainly plenty of evidence out there for how this team's victories and the actions of some of their key individuals were a source of such inspiration. And I'm fascinated by them because they're a team that are festooned really with incredible characters and personalities throughout. But I can't be here all day, so I just want to briefly talk about 3 of them. They're John Joe Sheehy, Con Brosnan, and Joe Barrett. So there's John Joe Sheehy. And of course, he gave a lifetime service to the Kerry GAA. When he died, aged 83, in 1980, he was still acting president of the Kerry County Board, 50 years after he won his last All-Ireland title. Likewise, he of course remained a committed Republican all his life. He earned his debut for Kerry as an 18-year-old in 1915 and joined the Irish Volunteers around the same time. During the War of Independence, as Deputy Commander of the Tree IRA, he oversaw the famous assassination in April 1921 of Major John McKinnon, the infamous local commander of the auxiliaries in North Kerry. Now, by the time of the Civil War, Sheehy was commanding officer of the Tree IRA, and he orchestrated the defence of the town following the National Army landings on Phoenix. 9 National Army personnel were killed before Sheehy's men were forced to abandon Tralee and resort to guerrilla warfare for the remainder of the conflict. And of course, Sheehy also happened to be hiding out near Ballyseedy on that fateful morning, and he helped hide Stephen Fuller from the authorities in the aftermath. And I suppose that he could see at such close hand the atrocity carried out on his IRA comrades in the name of the Free State, and still share a dressing room with the likes of Con Brosnan, a serving Free State officer. I think that's a testament to how much this team tried to play sport before politics. And of course, Con Brosnan was no less of a remarkable figure. In January of 1921, he had volunteered to assassinate RIC District Inspector Tobias O'Sullivan in Listowel, gunning down on the street a fellow Irishman caught on the wrong side of history as he walked home from lunch. Now, of course, this, the audacity of the attack and the success and the high profile of the man killed meant that immediately Con became a legend in the Kerry IRA. But actually his recollection of the event for the Bureau of Military History in 1955, it's actually so matter-of-fact about it. It's hard to remember that Brosnan was still only 21 at this time. He had no real combat experience, let alone that of killing anyone before this. Now, Con Brosnan was a firm supporter of the treaty, and he subsequently joined the National Army, serving as a captain. He remained a fervent Free State supporter all his life, and he actually ran for the Cumann na Gael party in the 1933 general election in North Kerry, narrowly missing out on a seat. But it's also very true that, like many of his generation, he bitterly regretted how the treaty had destroyed the unity of the IRA that both he and she, of course, had fought for. And as Fergal Keane has shown in his wonderful recent book, Wounds, Brosnan seemed to remain haunted by the events of those tragic and turbulent years, and his own hand in some of them. And it seems clear he suffered from what today would be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Football obviously provided him with an escape from that, though in later life, perhaps, he found some more escape in indulging a little too much in alcohol. And Brosnan, of course, knew well what had been done in Kerry in the name of the uniform he wore. And perhaps that's why he, more than anyone on that team, seemed to be so determined to keep politics at the dressing room door. Thank you. Because in an interview with J.J. Barrett in 1995, the great John Joe Perty-Landers described Brosnan as, quote, having incredible guts, and regardless of pressure from within his own side of the divide or from our side, he did what he believed had to be done to bring about peace and healing. He was the ultimate peacemaker in Kerry football after the Civil War. And of course, Landers and Brosnan's teammate Johnny Walsh concurred. In fact, Johnny Walsh recalled an incident on a team train to Dublin when he made some offhand comment about the tense political situation in Ireland during the early 1930s. And as he recalled, and I quote, "Con shut me up straight away by saying, 'Don't ever speak politics again on a football train.'" Now, Brosnan, during his years playing, did all in his power to reach out to the Republicans on the team. Famously, of course, before the 1924 Munster final in Limerick, it was Brosnan who arranged safe passage for Sheehy, still wanted by the authorities and on the run, to travel to the game. Although he was not named in the starting team, Brosnan seems to have informed a select inner circle of players that Sheehy would indeed be lining out. So Sheehy actually entered the ground in a trench coat, paying in, pretending to be a spectator, and then just before throw-in, he emerged from the crowd in his jersey and boots to take his place in the full forward line. And then once the match was won, Sheehy was allowed to disappear into the throng of spectators on the pitch, and he made good his escape from Limerick City. And in fact, they repeated that trick in the All-Ireland final the following April. Thanks. Now, Brosnan would become incredibly close with Rock Street's Joe Barrett, reckoned to be one of the finest fullbacks to ever grace a GAA field. Now Barrett had been captured while on the run during the Civil War, and after his release in December 1923 from internment, he made the symbolic importance of Kerry football in this era. And having already captained Kerry to victory in 1929, Barrett turned over his second captaincy in 1931 to Brosnan in what was a very powerful gesture of both reconciliation, but of course admiration for his friend and teammate. Now, as you can imagine, this was not a popular act in his hometown or in his club, Rock Street, which remained both hotbeds of republicanism. And Barrett seems to have come under intense pressure to reverse the decision, with many decrying the spectacle now of Kerry being captained by some Free Stater. Yet Barrett showed really huge courage to stick by his convictions that this gesture was for the good of the team and for the county. Brosnan then duly led Kerry to victory in 1931, and a year later, Barrett had his second chance to do likewise. So basically, given everything I've discussed about how the Civil War played out in Kerry, and given how seriously we Kerry people take our football and take our traditions around our football and GAA, I think the semantics and symbolism of what Brosnan did cannot be, or what Barrett did, I should say, cannot be overstated. It was one of the most powerful expressions of how Kerry football was trying to be used to bridge the bitter divide of the Civil War and its legacy. The next. But of course, this is life, it's not some Hollywood movie. There was, perhaps understandably, a lot of hyperbole and myth-building surrounding this Kerry team. But the reality is that the poisonous inheritance of the Civil War here was far too raw and complex to ever be erased either in Kerry or anywhere else by mere sporting triumph. The true story of this team is much more nuanced and multifaceted. than is often portrayed. And I reckon it's actually more remarkable and interesting because of all of that. Because the reason I'm so fascinated by the history of sport in a country like Ireland is that sport is this great, wonderful window into society at large. And for me, what's so enthralling about this Kerry team is how they reflect the ongoing impact of the Civil War divide on Irish society. Because behind all the success and symbolism and media praise, there were still divisions and distrust in that dressing room. And wearing a common jersey could never simply wipe away the world outside the pitch. For example, coming into the team from 1927, Percy Landers, who was another devout Republican, vividly described how the political differences within the dressing room created an atmosphere that he called, and I quote, most uncomfortable. Sometimes it was so bad that members of the other side in our team would come to the game already tired out. On the other side, his teammate, Tim O'Donnell, a member of the Garda Síochána, he remembers, and I quote, there were certainly great tensions in the dressing room at times when the political climate would boil over. And this uneasiness would be just too much for us to make a small talk and socialise with some of the other players. And as much as they respected each other, it seems clear that Sheehy and Brosnan could never be especially close because of their entrenched political views. Indeed, it was probably only Sheehy's sudden retirement from the team before the start of the championship in 1931, which actually probably allowed Barrett to make his famous captaincy gesture to Brosnan. I'm not sure Sheehy would have stood for it if he was still on the team, given his Republican values. Now, these political frictions were also very evident when Kerry organised its first tour of the US in May 1927, and that tour became with separate problems both on and off the field. So, the three matches Kerry played against the New York selection, they were held in the very famous Polo baseball grounds. Now, they attracted very impressive crowds of about 30,000 each, but unfortunately, Kerry didn't really seem to show up, and they were well beaten in all of those games. And exacerbated by this, just before the tour ended, their American promoter seems to just fled the team hotel, taking with him all the Kerry profits and the gate receipts. And while, of course, supposedly the tour was organised to purchase the Tralee Sports Ground, in reality, much of the tour was actually secretly orchestrated by the IRA's command to secure desperately needed funds for its depleted resources and forces. And John Joe Sheehy very much acted as a link man between the IRA and his teammates during the tour. And while he knew most of them had Republican sympathies, he was worried about the possibility of players like Tom Brosnan finding out what was going on and exposing the hidden hand of the IRA. Indeed, Sheehy actually suggested that Brosnan be sent threatening letters by the IRA, warning that his life would be in danger if he travelled to the US. Now, in the end, the fear that Brosnan might go public if he received such letters persuaded Sheehy and the IRA to drop this notion, and Brosnan travelled with the team. Now, outside of the matches, Sheehy was a guest of honour at a range of dances and rallies and social events intended to help IRA fundraising. Most remarkably, of course, Sheehy and those players who could be trusted actually agreed to smuggle home in their luggage a cache of Thompson submachine guns owned by the IRA and held for safekeeping in New York up to this stage. And of course, those weapons were subsequently distributed among active IRA units across Ireland. Thanks. Then, of course, in the early 1930s, you saw much of Ireland, I suppose, in the grip of what the historian Joe Lee called the last spasm of the Civil War. You had a revitalised IRA now coming into increasing conflict with the blue shirt movement emerging under Eamon Duffy. And in areas like my native North Kerry, hostility between both groups, obviously fueled by memories of the Civil War, now played out again in the wave of shootings, arson attacks, intimidation and violence. And all of this now brought the inherent tensions within the Kerry GA to boiling point in those years. The Lisdone GA, for example, split over its members' political differences into two rival teams, the Ashes and the Pierces. One North Kerry Championship match was abandoned after a full-scale riot broke out among supporters amid goals and shouts of "Up the Blue Shirts." Then you came to the 1933 general election, which was incredibly volatile. And you'll see probably the very emotive and starkly imagery of the election posters at that time from Fianna Fáil and Conn McGael. But it was so volatile in North Kerry, the election campaign, that at the close of polling in Ballyduff, an altercation between blue shirts backing Brosnan's campaign for election and local Fianna Fáil activists ended with a Fianna Fáil official being shot in the leg. Now, Brosnan, increasingly disgusted at how the blue shirt movement was developing under Duffy, actually resigned from it only a couple of weeks later. And so the wounds of the Civil War were reopening now at this time. And it was at this time that the Kerry team itself threatened to be torn apart by their ideological divisions. Johnny Walsh, for example, clearly remembered those rising tensions within the Kerry dressing room, given that many players were now associated with either the Blue Shirts or the IRA. And coming himself from a very staunch Cumann Gael family, Walsh's status as a Kerry player did little to protect him. And there he is there in later life. He recalls that in Easter of 1933, he was involved in a violent altercation with members of the local IRA who tried to vandalise his parents' pub. And after this, he was branded as a Blue Shirt. And when the Kerry selectors failed to pick him for the Kerry team in 1934, Walsh later stated, and I quote, "I was dropped simply because of my politics." Disillusioned by this, he actually turned to playing rugby for Garryowen, before eventually being persuaded by his teammate, Mick O'Doyle, to come back to reclaim his place on the Kerry team in 1936. In the next slide. Now look, I suppose if there's one truth in sport, it's that no one likes to see anyone dominating too long, and I'm sure I'm not the only person here that's sticking to the teeth of the Dubliners and their marches to All Ireland over the last 10 years. And very similarly, by the early 1930s, similar criticism of Kerry's success was very much palatable and growing. After swatting aside Monaghan, for example, in the 1930 All Ireland, reckoned to be one of the most one-sided All-Ireland finals in history, the Monaghan County Board lodged an official complaint about what they claimed to be, and I quote, the brutality of the Kerry play, which left several of their players sprawled on the floor injured as Kerry romped to victory. Following this, and following Kerry's 1932 All-Ireland victory over Mayo, it was now the turn of the Kerry County Board to protest, stating that before the throw-in, the referee had entered the Kerry dressing room and began to insult the team by declaring that in his view, they had a well-earned reputation for blackguarding their opponents, and if he saw them do the same thing today, he would simply stop the match. No comment. Anyway, so by the start of 1933, of course, they're going for an unprecedented 5 in a row. And in previewing the championship, the Irish Daily Express worried that, quote, the superiority of Kerry is now the most serious problem for Gaelic administrators. But as ever, that was the classic commentator's curse, because the team finally met their Waterloo on the 27th of August 1933, when Cavan defeated them by a goal in the All-Ireland semi-final in Breffni Park. And you can see the headlines there. It was Kerry's first championship defeat since July 1928, and the Anglo-Celt actually declared in the aftermath that the result was, quote, one of an event of international importance. Kerry, of course, the tragedy is Kerry almost escaped as well. A last desperate Kerry attack at the Cavan goal saw Bill Landers inexplicably kick the ball inches wide when he found himself in front of an open net. As Shakespeare would say, all good things come to an end, I suppose. So to conclude, you might know that John Josheen was actually very involved, in fact, spearheaded the campaign to erect a memorial to the Ballyseedy massacre. That's its official unveiling on the 5th of September 1959. My dad remembers it very well, the huge crowds there. And of course, Sheedy spoke briefly at the official unveiling itself. And in his address, he pleaded for the monument to be seen as an example of how, quote, we forgive, but we do not forget the events of the Civil War. And that's a good mantra for the next couple of years. And hopefully we never forget what I believe is not just the most remarkable Kerry team of all time. I think they're the most remarkable team in all of Irish sports history. Now I'm currently working on a project which hopefully will result in an intelligent documentary about this team. And I pray it'll come to pass, and I pray it'll do justice to these men and the year they lived through, because I hope everyone here will agree with me. Theirs is one hell of a story. Thank you very much.
You want to list after that? Richard and Mila. Have a chat among yourselves for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to call in alphabetical order the Barretts and the Rostons. And then we'll move on to a different crowd after that. So have a chat among yourselves for a minute, and then we'll ask every swimmer of the Barrett family members to say a few words. Time up. Richard, sit down, 6 years there. So I'm going to say that. as Richard says, silence is not golden, especially when it comes to, I suppose, there was a lot of silence about this particular period. But I went to get to Dennis Healy's book there, and listen to this eulogy. The Boys from Kerry, 1924. He has helped to Ryan and Landers, Paul Russell and Bob Stank. Good luck to brave Joe Barrett, who is Kerry, Stonewall back. Drink up to Connie Brosnan from sweet and famed Newtown, and 3 cheers for Jack Argoli, who never once went down. To Jim and Johnny Bailey, and Billy Macker here today, to Jim and Johnny Bailey, who stood the test serene, and dashing John Joe Sheehy, true men of the gold and green. Did you hear that before? Well, there I know that's Miss B. Lady wrote it, Miss B. Flynn of Tralee, published in the Kerry in 1924. And I told you there are 30 pages, 15 ballads in Healy's book about this period that Richard has covered. 15 different ballads, recitations and poems, and so some of them to be sung, of course, as well. Can you imagine? You know? So now I'm going to ask now some member of maybe the ballads. And by the way, that's Jojo's book, Banat Anam, which Richard showed us there in his lovely slide. And what you might know, some of you, that Jojo gave a present to me, his other book called Not for Daedalus. And there's one poem that's called It's Only the League. I wanted the Jackal Hammer out tonight. It's Only the League, one of his poems. But this is his poem, Not for Daedalus. Why he's called that title, I asked him. He told me because he submitted it to a publishing company called Daedalus, and he got a note back with 3 words, Not for Daedalus. So he gave me a present to that. Eddie or Johnny, B for Barrett, and then Brussels up next. There's a roving mic there. So share a few thoughts, share a few stories maybe, please. That's
I suppose my abiding memories, first of all, of the Brosnan family is Dr. Jim and his wife coming into our house in Tralee on a regular basis. And Dr. Jim, who would be giving us all the advice medically in the day, possibly in the back of his head, always brought a bag of sweets for the kids in our family. That's an abiding, lovely memory. But right up to when he passed, we kept in touch, and it was, I suppose, the friendship that was born out in football became such a phenomenal friendship in life. And as regards politics, my mum remained a dedicated Republican to the day she died, and a member of Sinn Féin, as most of our family have. But we never left politics entered the fray at all when it came to sport. And I'm a member of Austin Stack's club since I came back to Kerry in 1973, and I'll tell this story very quickly. I brought my dad, who was ailing at the time, Tommy, that's Joe Barrett's brother, to the convention of the club, as it used to be called in those days, the AGM, and it was being held up in the Brothers' School in Clonalore in Tralee. And so my dad wasn't driving at the time, he was after having a few strokes, and so I went in with him anyway, and I had no ambitions whatsoever at getting involved on the day, but I walked out of there joint treasure with Ty Crowley. And Ty Crowley was a huge man in our club over all the years, and as you possibly would remember, he was treasurer of the county board as well. But I hadn't even realised until I stood up at the end of the meeting that I'd been actually elected, because it was done so surreptitiously. But I remember before every meeting in those years, and it's probably a reflection of what happened way back in the 20s, there's a golden rule in our club always: no politics. So if there was ever a contest for positions or otherwise, the golden rule was that there would be no politics would enter the room under any circumstances. And I can say with absolute pride that we never left it in the 49 years I'm still involved. I'm county board delegate for the club, along with Jim Nocton, and in all those years since that we've been involved, we've never left it enter the door. And so much so that our hurling team for years and years used to be made up of every Garda that was transferred to Tralee that played hurling and probably wasn't good enough to play for his own county or his own club at home would be dedicated to the Rock Club automatically. Hence there's a club, a dedicated hurling club in Tralee now, which is made up of all the other clubs called Parnells. But the whole ethos that came from the relationship of Con Brosnan and Joe Barrett, and I'm very proud to have Joe Barrett's grandson beside me here, Johnny, who has threatened me already that he doesn't want to say a word, but I think Joe Barrett died back in 1953. I was only 2 years old when he passed. He was only 49 years of age at the time. By today's standards, that's very young. And I have no recollection whatsoever of him, except that on the evening he passed, and he passed away in 67 Rock Street, which was the family home, ironically, and I could tell you the bedroom he died in upstairs. Apparently I was just a 2-year-old at the time, and I was put in beside him for about 10 or 15 minutes. That tradition, I had never heard of before until my mother and father told me in latter years that he was such a force within our family that, that you could put a baby in beside someone that had just passed away. And I suppose it's a kind of an eerie reflection on one hand, but it just shows the love that went on within the family itself, that he was such a loss in the family at that stage, and he was the eldest brother at that time. His elder brother, Christy, and my grandfather both died, ironically, in what was referred to as the Spanish flu in 1919, which the irony of today is well matched. So, thank you for the time.
Just to say that Joe won 7 county senior football titles and 3 hurling titles. That's in Richard's book. And I knew Father Mihal's mother, Kitty Calvin, whom I actually anointed. I was home from Peru actually, and there was no priest around in Tralee. I was the priest who would anoint Kitty. So that was a connection. That's Joe's sister. And I introduced me to the Brosnans. I didn't know Con Brosnan, I don't think, but I knew Sister Brendan and the famous nun as well, Sister Carmel Brosnan, Joe's 2 sisters, and of course we know. So Connor's here, and Mick Crahur, Masha Holly, there's a roving mind there if you like. And Connor actually, when I was in Dingle, asked me to speak on this very theme. I called my theme that day, When the Hills Were Red and the Fields Golden. That was because Connor is very involved in the historical group back in Dingle. So that was a talk I gave on this kind of topic. So Connor, Masha Holly, over to you.
Thank you, Father Tom, and I'd like to thank Richard McElligott for a very inspirational, illustrated talk just now. It was really good and much appreciated. I was 8 or 9 years old when my grandfather died, so I would have heard stories. I think they were mostly football stories. They just did not talk about what happened in the War of Independence or the Civil War. I would have read it, and football was something that was celebratory, and it was a healthier thing to talk about. But we did realise, alright, that there was friendships, and I think J.J. Barrett's book brings it out clearly, and what Porter Lambert said as well is important. And Richard touched on it as well. I think our grandfather, I think when you're involved in killing people at 21, there's obviously a psychological issue of trauma, and there was a lot of trauma, and so I think it's only been discussed about now when PTSD is mentioned, and it's probably what a lot of them had, and it led on to alcoholism unfortunately. I think the county through football has illustrated, and it's something we're very proud of accommodation. It's probably it's a good word because it covers a lot. People have to live, and I think it's something that we can hopefully will get us over the next year and a half of of commemoration, and probably best done on a local basis with local personalities, would be probably the best way to commemorate the Civil War and the hardship and the hurt. And I think that historians and Richard would have a role in that, and maybe community leaders as well on a local level. I'll hand over to my first cousin Mike, who would have more memories than of our grandfather.
I suppose I'm a few years old, and I remember Con at home and walking up and down the road, and we'd be there, and we were back in the field a few times, and we were first young lads that I was 11, and he just turned 12 in a few days, but he was you dared to play soccer inside the sports field. And that was the trait, and if you saw him coming down the road, if word came down the road, you picked up the ball and you were told. And it was, he walked very straight, and that would be my memory of him. He just walked up and down the road. You looking back at it now, you know he was army trained and the whole lot. He always carried himself fierce straight like and that. But you know, my father never spoke about it, and he only died there 3 or 4 years ago. But they never spoke about it at different times and things. But he always talked about the time with Joe Barrett, that when he'd come out to the pub in my van, and they'd be there, and you daren't go into the kitchen while the two of them were there. And he said the funny thing was that there wasn't a lot even spoke between the two of them. But once they were in each other's company, and it just seemed to that was the bond, and that for me out of the whole thing too. Should have happened today in our own thing, wouldn't there be war, and there was no politics. If Austin Stacks were asked to give someone outside in our Kerry captain of the Kerry team, as it is right now, wouldn't there be a second one in Kerry football? Not to mind the politics of the day, like, so I suppose he was held in high esteem. But you know, when my father was stayed at home, and he was, as he said himself, the buy all the money was spent in the buys, and he was kept at home. But he was always under orders, or if there was someone there, he was always under orders to never be too far away from the pub, because when someone could come in, could stir around and poke up the grandfather, and they had to be ready to quench it. Because your man, you know, he became a bit, there was, you know, with the shooting of the DI, and there's more even that we didn't even know about, unveiling even in the last couple of months with Fergal Keane and different things that was actually never spoke about. You know, in some of this, there was one there where Connor was there, we say they shot the DI he was 21, and there was a fellow in the stall then willing to testify that it was Con Brosnan. And they knew this, and they knew the man, and word came down from Dublin, it's a case of shoot or be shot. And they had to go out at 1 o'clock on a summer's night and shoot the man that was going to testify, or be shot themselves, and be you know. So they had a troubled career, they never again settled down, he had a troubled life, but he, you know, the whole thing was that it was all football. All he ever wanted was football and peace, and every youngster in my van, once they'd be playing football, he'd give them shillings and pounds and whatever, the young lads going to university or anything. When in later time, Johnny Mulvin out to just play and the whole lot, Con would give him a fiver to come down, and like he said, we were the richest men going up to university in Dublin. Once they were doing that, like, you know, he was, but it was funny. The funniest thing of all was my father never spoke about it much, only when Jojo came out and we were there for the day at home at the table doing the book and a few different pieces, and there was never a lot spoke about it. But funny, when about 6 months before my father died, he couldn't stay away from the. They used to stay over when they were on the run. They used to stay over in Henry's farm. It was Pat, Joe and Johnny. Some of you might know them on the football terms. But their house, their farm was at the end of the road, and then you had the bog to escape to when they were on the run. And you know, the biggest thing was that when they'd be gone. But before my father died, we don't know what came of him, but he went over to that house about 10 times. And we never even knew the shed or where he was and the whole lot, you know, but the boys that had from being on the run and the whole lot, like, they really had some, we don't know what, you know, covered in lice, covered in this stuff, you know, everything like they were, it was just fascinating stuff, really, of course, yeah. So that's it, yeah.
So the next one will be Gerald Landers is here, and I played football with Gerald and they're really involved in hurling, but wait till you see what the Landers were involved in. Gerald, his dad, Bill, whom I remember when I didn't realise what Bill had achieved and what he'd been through. Gerald might share a few words with Gerald, see you. Thanks. Gerald himself is a big man in the NAC, cycling and athletics, hurling of course, and they're still hurling, the Landers.
Good evening, I didn't expect this. But his brother twice there, Con came, a third friend of my father in the 50s, and actually his wife. I can remember visiting our house on numerous occasions, and I think the grandmother, she brought the porter came to our house, really what I'm talking about. And I think I brought her cousin, she had red hair. She had red hair, and very like him. But when my father was based here around Glencar at the time of the Troubles, and I could never figure that out, but it was how the number were depleted here, and I think John Joshi sent over 3 people to Glencar side. One was a Williams man, and another was Daly man, and my father. So that's why he was in the South Kerry Brigade, but he was never arrested. So after the 24 final, which was played, I think, the 26th of April, 25, he immigrated to America and played over. And I think he played against visiting teams in 27, 29, and 31, I expect. And in 32,
that's this is the economic crash, the Wall Street crash, and George told me how his dad came back to Kerry. Listen to this.
Yeah. And right of the Depression in America in 32, let us say my mother's people were involved in the rising as well. They were out for them. But in 32, my father and his brother-in-law, John Reen, they chartered a ship, filled it with pilgrims, to come home to the Eucharistic Congress in 32. And he was to stay for a month or 2 here in Ireland. He came down to Killarney and got a job driving a truck from my house. That was the shop, the people that owned Mackie Shares at the time, and stayed. And his wife and the 2 children were all in America. They came, I think, in November. But he stayed and he got on the panel that year and came on to the final. He had played, of course, over all the years over.
He scored a hat-trick of goals. But they very hard to a hat-trick that time. Can you remember when that was? In the run into one that was in the semi-final, I think. Bill Landers scored 3 goals. We were all 13 all around it, but Bill was the forgotten member of that Trinity.
Well, he was older than...
He was, I remember.
He was 6 or 7 years older than 48, so, yeah. So that was basically it.
Did he finish up?
There was a few other...
Did he work in St. Philip's? Did he work with Dr. Eamon? Was that right?
Oh, he did, yes. The hospital there. Eamon wrote a book and was talking football all the time. But there were 1 or 2 little things I'd tell. The time, my father and captain, the 2 coming to American 33. And Jack Dempsey was the man that was sponsoring the trophy. And they went through the procedure for the start of the match, and Jack Dempsey was to throw in the football. And he said, what did I do when I throw in the football? Johnny, you've been set run for your life.
Johnny was a Mitchell's.
She was heavyweight champion of the world at the time.
Thank you, Joe, very much. Couldn't be involved. And just to say what people might never know, my granddad, Tom Crosstown Looney, would have been a sub here one time for the Long Rangers, I think, was captain of Kerry in 1902, beaten in a replay by Tipperary, mind you. Kerry was a sub the following year, but he married Jane Dillon, whose brother was the Kerry goalie at the time, Pat Dillon, 03, 04 and 09. And Dick Fitzgerald married the other sister, Kitty. So therefore, I want to say a small bit about that. But I'll quote a quotation if I would here from Trailblazers. And that's not the book about Long Rangers. Trailblazers, the history of the club. Now, when we were in those club histories, there was very little to go on except kind of the local newspapers and maybe memory. But this is a quotation out of Trailblazers, 1922, page 58. September 27th was a night of terror in Killorglin. There was intense fighting. To this day, bullet marks can be seen in the church railing and in the corner of Bill Shea's house. Paddy Murphy of Dukes was shot in the alleyway at the rear of the houses of Upper Bridge Street. Looney, Conor Looney actually, Cornelius Looney of Kenmare was shot in the Mill Road, and he was my grandfather's cousin, Cornelius Looney. Jack Galvin was taken prisoner, tortured, executed in Ballyseedy. And the book, I know Tim Horgan's here, not Tim, wrote 4 books. One was up there well ago, The Men Will Talk to Me. He was involved in the Kerry one, with Ernie O'Malley, Cormac O'Malley. And the Galway one, it was Tim's grandfather and grandmother did very much here on both sides. And one of his books, Fighting for the Cause, and this one, Dying for the Cause. They're the words of the late Con Looney, his memoir now, the crossroads there in Kenmare. And then on my mother's side, she was Alice O'Neill. Her father, Daniel O'Neill, was the first cousin of Stephen Buckley, the first name on the monument in Countess Bridge, the 7th of March 1923. And my mother's a child. You talk about the dugouts. She used to be in the dugout with the children as a child, playing with the guns. And she was there the week the men were betrayed, brought to the Great Sutherland Hotel, tortured and executed. And she remembered that when she was only 6 years of age, so there's no wonder after she died coming on as a young woman, as her brother did as well, the 30s. I'm only saying that because a lot of us, in fact many of us here have stories like that from our own people, but there was great silence. We weren't told very much about that. In the Monaghan game, the day after the Irish Independence, 1930, that game that Richard mentioned, that was the weekend that Dick Fitzgerald died. But Dick Fitzgerald had been a Sinn Féin urban councillor, and he, on the Collins side, on the treaty side, became a Common Mile. He was at the council in Killorglin for 10 years, but there was a great tribute to him in Dublin that day, and my dad, Jack, was down the following day in the paper as next of kin. In fact, he really wasn't next of kin, but according to the Irish Independent, he and his brother Paddy were down as next of kin. But so our family would have been both sides. We would have seen, as many of us had, but we weren't told that about it growing up, certainly it wasn't. But I was at the, how many hands up here were at the opening of the Ballyseedy Monument? Hands up, who were at it? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4 of us. Just, I pity Brian Sheehy isn't here. No, there was a junior on that afternoon, semi-final, I think, with Roscommon. And we marched out the mile height. And I'd say Gil Bryan's band was there, I'd say, only could be sure it was, yeah. So we all marched out, and I'll never forget those words, which you have, in fairness, enshrined. We forgive, we do not forget. Now, Brian must be here, Brian Sheehy, but he sent his apology last evening. Any member of the Sheehy family here? No. No, is it there are other people here now, so what I will do so, so I'm just recommending some of those books that you get in the library, Joe's books, and Dennis Healy's books. So a chance to do further bit of maybe research to study. And I over now to Richard, and he'll take any questions that you might have from the floor. And there's a floating mic here as well. So people like to share a question or even an anecdote or a story maybe. Or maybe a correction if you want to talk to me, by all means do please. Thanks, family members, thanks for those sharings. Beautiful. That's what Jerome and his company have wanted.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if anyone's any questions or comments or... Yes.
I would like to say...
Get the microphone.
After the massacre in Ballyseedy, Stephen Fuller, he was taken to Knockon back in Ballyfinane for 2 nights, and then he was brought to the home of where John Linehan, the famous Fuller, is now kept. But he was then brought to our farm in Minity, Ballymac, and where he remained for 7 months in a dugout, which can still be seen, the outline of that dugout can still be seen. But John Joe Sheehy was one of the main men that brought him to our place. Now, at that time, in 1918, McElligott won the County Senior Football Championship. And they had a very good team. The Baileys that were mentioned there was 5 Bailey brothers playing in that team, including Dinjo Bailey, who was the longest serving officer of Kerry County Board. He served on the Kerry County Board through all that healing process in the 20s, and he was still on the County Board in 1952 when he dropped in the beach at Ballyhide. But getting back to it, that football team in Ballymac, Phil Sullivan was playing with him as well, and the Troubles broke up that team. We didn't win a county championship since, I suppose. We're not likely to win either. You know, like that is, and I felt it was that as a former chairman of the Ballymac Club, I served chairman that one 3 times, that I should come here today to pay a homage to the Joe Bailey's part and to John Joe Sheehy's.
Hearing of Callan stopping the 5 in a row, yeah? Brings me to a little anecdote. My sister was GP in Killishandra, where the great Packy farm lived. So Packy was dying, and my sister said, "Will you go down and, you know, just talk to him?" Said, "Joan," I said, "I don't know the man, what can I do?" So I went down, I went, and Packy is there, as the saying goes, face to the wall, and started the little game. There was no reply. But then I said, "Packy, I'm from Kerry. My name is John Helen, Dr. John's brother. I suppose you remember Michael died. And wherever he got the strength from, he came up on his elbow. Aye, he says, a dirty little bastard." I think that will be his last words. But just one, I'm always picking the crumbs off the rich man's table, Father Tom, yeah? But we soldiered together in Peru and later in San Salvador. And I just wanted, there's a wall in San Salvador where 36,000 names of those who, documented dead in month order. And I'd always remember the last phrase in it, "Para que no se repita," that it may never be repeated. And I think that's what we should be, what you call, proud of our past and moving forward together as great men and women that we are.
Historians like me would argue that's why we talk about the past, so you can move on, because there's no point pretending something didn't happen, because you'll never get over it, you'll never mature. So that's what, I mean, I suppose that was the whole point of the Decade of Commemorations. In one way, it's just to confront it, to be open about it, to talk about it, to hear the stories, to understand your past, and then go, this is what happened. It's not something to celebrate, maybe. Certain parts aren't something to celebrate. Some parts certainly are to be ashamed of, but As I always tell my students, war school, that's what history is. You can't just tell the good stuff. You have to tell the bad stuff, or else what you know. So I think that's it. Remember and move on for better.
Thank you, Doctor, and I just want to firstly, Patrick O'Connor Scartine from Kenmare is my name. I just firstly want to thank the Historical Society. I think you do some fantastic work here, and this is, I suppose, the first of many, and look, it's going to be a difficult year and a half coming up, but I'm sure if other people took the example of the Historical Society here, it will be dealt with very respectfully and fairly, and I suppose, look, we're hearing stories there of the GAA, and to be fair, like this needs to be told nationwide, and it is, and I see your work with the jersey and everything, it's very good, because like the work that those people, whichever side they were on, at that time, it was fantastic, and it just shows what a wonderful organisation the GAA is throughout the country, and just hearing the story of the Barretts there and the Brosnans and how their families could interact afterwards, and you know, put the politics aside and that, and move on. And it's important to remember the past, you know, when we're looking to the future. And even, I suppose, my own family were involved in Captain John O'Connor and Brigadier General Tom O'Connor Scartine. They were in the Free State Army, and they were shot dead unarmed in our home. But at that time, it just goes to show that Tom McEllistrom came in and sympathised with their mother and had tea with her because they fought together in the War of Independence. And it just goes to show the personal connections at the time and how difficult, you know, it was. But you know, people move on, people try and get on with each other, and sport was a great healing factor in that in the GAA. So well done to yourselves, and as I said, the Historical Society here, and I'm sure people will here in Kerry will deal with it respectfully. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The great pity is that history now is not compulsory anymore, and I hope to deal with that. I certainly question that decision. Well, we're very lucky to have a video now of interviews that were done by Rishi Fogarty with winning captains, and they included John Josh Sheehy and the family of Con Brosnan and the family of Joe Barrett. So we've just Aidan, you take over.
One of the most renowned Kerry GA families of all time is the Sheehys of Tralee. It's unique that the father and son captained Kerry to All-Ireland glory. John Joe captained Kerry to victory in 1926 and 1930, while his son Sean Og was presented with the Salmon Wire Cup in 1962. John Joe was very proud of the fact that all his 4 sons won All-Ireland medals with Kerry. Here, John Joe recalls some of his fondest memories.
Every game stands out, and they all have their own particular memories for one. Perhaps the 1924 All-Ireland, which was our first and which was Kerry's first after 10 years in the wilderness, was a game that should be remembered. You might remember that we played in Beat Dublin on that day with the famous O'Toole's, a wonderful club they were to, and that was a very pleasant game. But however, the 26 All-Ireland stands out stronger in my mind, and maybe sweeter. You remember we had a drawn game with your own Ibrahim and poor Jack Murphy, the name of the Killorglin Archive. He played a Herculean game on that day. He saved us that day, and Bill Gorman then in the last dying minutes brought along the goal that equalised. I got a chance myself in the end, and my kick, fortunately or unfortunately, sailed wide at the post and gave us a chance of another day which we won, as you remember, and we are All-Ireland Chapter 1926.
Has John Joe been a great help to you in your playing career?
Oh yes, of course. Especially coming from a county like Kerry, which is so football conscious, and having a father who was so completely dedicated to the games. It has always been my ambition
try and follow in his footsteps.
Are people always comparing you? Oh yes, they're saying you'll never be as good a manager as father.
And do you find that rather frustrating to hear people saying that?
No, I don't think any nonsense.
Do you believe you will be a better man, you are a better man than your father?
No, I don't think so.
I remember John Sheehy vividly playing for Kerry. In the 1924 final, he was seen to great advantage, but especially in the memorable game against Kildare, playing under Keynes in 1926, the draw and replay. He almost won the draw, but the last kick of his own. Later, when another Kerry stammering like O'Dyle, John Joe went to the wing, where he enhanced his reputation. What I remember particularly about John Joe was his great ground football. He was the most accurate kicker and scored from difficult angles. He was a great man to rally and a penalty beaten team, and he could be described as the last of the great Kerry captains.
Now Sheehy, growing up as a Sheehy, and even today, of course, the name is synonymous with Kerry football, isn't it now?
Well, it was all football, I think.
Yeah.
Every Sunday we were above the sports week, and some of my friends would go to the matinee, but there was no matinee for us, it was always the sports week. No matter what match was on, we'd be up there, every Sunday.
Was it a bit of a burden for you carrying the name of your dad? I mean, John Joe Sheehy was a legendary figure, still is, of course.
Yeah, but no, it wasn't. We didn't feel it, because everybody was playing football at the North lads and Clonbeg, you know. There was about 20 young fellas around Clonbeg at the time, and we used to play teams from Castle Countess and teams from Boherby properly.
You must have great memories of your dad and the boys growing up. Was it all football?
Yes, it was. Morning, noon and night it was football. But it really was a young girl's dream. Ken and myself, can you imagine all those fine footballers calling every day? Because naturally we knew all the 5-year-old crowd already, who were wonderful. But we got to know all the Kerry footballers, and then when they went on further, we got to know all the Down team, the Dublin team, the Galway team. And to this very day, we're still very friendly with the McCartons, the McKnights, the O'Neills, Jimmy Keaveney.
Tell us about your mum. Who was she?
My mum was a very, very beautiful woman. She was Nora Murphy from Kishgame in County Cork. He had to go over the border to get a wife. It was a little fright.
What kind of an individual was John Joe Sheehy? What kind of a dad was he?
Yeah, he was fine out. Of course, there's our football, football and hurling. Going to matches. When I'd be playing, I'd have to give a full report that night, who played well, the top of the team, and he'd go through everything.
Very passionate man, he wasn't he?
Very passionate.
Then in 1962, when Sean Moore captained Kerry to that historic win over Roscommon, yourself and Paddy were playing. What did it mean to the whole family and to yourself to be on the team with Sean Moore?
There was a lot of tension anyway, before the match. We were hoping the match would be over and won, but it was great when we won, naturally, but before the match was very tense. There was terrible tension in the house and everything. So I think we were the first three brothers to win in All-Ireland together.
What was the homecoming like now in 62, if you probably remember, when Sean Moore was brought back to Kerry with the cup and you're the two brothers with him?
It was fantastic, it was fantastic.
What's your fondest memory of it?
I think going through Killorglin station, as a matter of fact, Sean he was cheered down, they got off the train in Killorglin, and they cheered him down on their shoulders, and there was great excitement out of it.
Playing together must have been very special to be inside in a dressing room and go home at night and talk about it. Something special, isn't it?
Oh, it was very special.
Yeah.
The only thing I say, if one of the lads got a dirty bit, like you said, it would upset you.
Yes, yeah. What's your fondest memory playing with your brothers now? What victory stands out playing with the boys?
Well, I suppose the 59 county championship group, that was the first one we won.
Yeah.
And Paddy had played in, I think, two before, but he never won anything. So he was delighted after that. And the first time before us were in a championship team together.
Paddy was one of the first of the stylish, well, he was very stylish there, very fast, and what I remember one night was running along and chipping the ball up in full flight. Yeah.
Well, he trained him actually, he practiced every night.
Yeah. And of course, Brinesy was an outstanding midfielder, played with Mick O'Connell and played against him and everything.
Played with Mick O'Connell, yes. He was a great fielder, but he started off, of course, Connell back, but Hardy and Brendan Gallagher centre field for Mitchells. And they were about 5'5" each, so Brinesy had to go to centre field and catch a few high balls, which he did. And he played very well thereafter.
Then finally, now, your dad, when he died, talked to us about his final days in the funeral.
Well, he was sick for about 2 or 3 months. He had diabetes as well. Well, he had diabetes all his life.
Yeah.
But he was tough enough out finish. He died in the bonds. But
he got a massive send-off.
He got a massive send-off.
That's very special to family to see that like the
well, we didn't expect that send-off.
Yeah. Well, we're here in the village of Myvan, the home of the legendary Con Brosnan, who captained Kerry to victory in 1931.
Con was captain of the Kerry team in 1931 by virtue of Rockridge and Joe Barrett. They won the championship in 1930. And I think that, it was a sign of what esteem he was held in as well, that was given to him, because at the time he was after playing in 3 losing county finals. He lost all 3, having captained all 3. And for that point of view, I suppose they recognised his worth and his value. And as a footballer, the Rock Street were the main team at the time, and they had won, and they had captained the Kerry team. And as a magnanimous gesture to Con and to his work to the Kerry team, they gave him the captaincy of the Kerry team for 31 All Ireland.
What does it mean to be the son of Con Brosnan?
Well, for me, I suppose I would never play football at all. So I won 2 medals that I, but I wouldn't do school. But the 2 gym medals and we have medals from again. So to all football, all morning, noon and night, to that into football. We young as grown up, we'd be outside in the yard kicking the ball and kicking, and he was outside with us, and we'd have to kick. It didn't matter this, we'd have to do it for nothing but kicking the ball and making football out of it. But he played in football with me.
We always had the medals as the background in the bar, and any time you were in the bar you were immersed in football and in success really, and there was always, my van football was always going strong, and they opened the field in 1984 in honour, and I suppose at that stage we learned a good bit more about Con, because sometimes it wouldn't be spoken about because it wouldn't come up very often, but at the time that the football field was open, it came up and the park was called after him, so it was a great honour. And at the time, for the booklet, they had a history of Con, so we did learn a lot about it at that time in particular.
It was tough on me because they all thought I was going to be right good. And I was not. When my father didn't break the mould and be as good as his grandfather, they thought I was going to be the man then. So I
just had to carry the name.
It was, to be honest with you, because I wasn't living up to everybody's expectations. And for that reason, it wasn't easy. You got a lot. I went away to boarding school at 12, and when you were up there, a lot of the teachers, they found out who you were. Oh, this fella's going to win all around him here for the psychology and everything. But I played away. I was, I suppose, more like my father than my uncles, Jim and me all. I played away. But my memory, I played there with my van. I enjoyed it. I had 10 or 12 great years playing there with my van. I don't think I'll remember from my football ability now, but we just enjoyed it.
What are your memories of your grandfather?
I remember him, I was 12, just 12, the same month as he died. And you remember him walking up and down the road, and you remember him as being very steady, straight walking man, and when he'd see him kicking the ball or anything, you'd nearly be half afraid, like, because I still remember him being, he'd want you to kick it in the door, and when you missed the door, you were in trouble, like, and the ball didn't always go wherever we wanted it to go, but, he was always out watching me playing football, and he'd want you kicking it, and I remember along the front of the house one time, he'd be there with you kicking it, and it was all ball, alright, I suppose, with him.
What had he that made him such a great footballer?
I don't know, I suppose it really is legendary stuff, isn't it? You'd have to say that, like, his whole contribution to, he didn't come from football pedigree before him. There was no athleticism that we know of in the family before him. His own father reportedly came from America and bought this pub here around late 1800s. He was supposed to have come from America and the Walsh. They had given him the captaincy in 1931. That, for me, probably epitomises the man. It was some gesture to gift him the time, and it didn't even go down well in Tralee with a lot of the Tralee crowd. The footballers saw that football was his heart, and that was his love, and that's what he wanted.
That, more than anything, I suppose, more than any winning his 6 medals, that one gesture is very, very special in his whole life, isn't it?
I think so. I think, even in today's terms, like, there was more players in Tralee brought to get the captaincy again, like, and they sought to give it to this man outside in Kerry. You put it in today's circumstances. If Austin Stacks won the county championship today, like, they get the captaincy out to Field Rangers, wouldn't go down well in Tralee, would it? But in a lot more troubled times that time, we were after coming out of the Civil War. He must have left some impression on all the players for everyone to agree with him and to do that. Like.
How do you think your grandfather is being remembered?
One of the great legends of Kerry football at midfield, because he was only reportedly 5'10", and everybody seems to have memories of him being a mighty fielder and having a spring for the ball and that kind of thing. So I suppose he must be up there with him. That would be what you would remember him of. Yeah.
How will you remember your dad? How will you remember the legendary Con Brosnan?
Richard, as a footballer, and as a lot.
We would never have seen Con Brosnan play football. A lot of people would never have seen Con Brosnan play football. A lot of people would never have seen a lot of modern day footballers play football. But from what has been written and what has been said, Con Brosnan must be up there with the greats of Kerry football.
Gabriel, the pitch in my van, of course, is called after Con Brosnan, isn't it?
Well, indeed it is. And what's going to be called after it? The greatest footballer that came out of my van, and my van has produced many all-Ireland winning footballers, including sons of Cons. But Con was the greatest. Con was reckoned to be one of the finest midfielders that Kerry ever produced. And on the 17th of June 1984, the field was dedicated to him and opened by Kerry playing Laois, and a local man at the time, Johnny Mulvihill, who was a Kerry footballer, captained Kerry on that day, and we beat Laois. Sean Welch was the chairman of the My Van Club at the time, and he commissioned a local poet, a very fine man, a very fine poet and a fine storyteller called Dan Keane, who is, I think, 91 years of age now, still with us, thanks be to God. And he commissioned a poem for the opening of Con Brosnan Park. When but a child I heard his name poured out from lips that spoke with pride, I relished every loud acclaim, my heart like theirs felt overjoyed. I placed him in the Fianna mould, through childish dreams the vision ran. I longed to see the green and gold, I longed and hoped to meet this man. This man in later years I met, his manner harboured no disguise, his honest heart and goodness set, with modesty his greatest prize. And yet sufficient spirit reigned to stand for right, to raise to flame the bursting cheers that oft acclaimed his jewelled movement in this game. This game he loved and sporting played, from antiquity's ancient store, the living spark official made, and trained the Gael to love it more. The names with pride we still recall, their souls its source, their hearts its shield. Through time and space we bless them all, and make their monument this field. This field through which he calls in trust the Gaels to love and play the game. God keeps his soul, the grave his dust, we proudly give this field his name. And here while summer breezes kiss the bending grass and steal away, we play the game in hours like this, we bless this man, this field, this day.
Joe Barrett of Tralee was the first Kerry captain to bring the Salmon Wild Cup to Kerry in 1929, and he also captained the Kerry winning team of 1932. His son Jojo joins us to talk about it. Jojo, what did it mean to you later in life, and what did it mean to your dad having captain Kerry in 29 and 32?
Personally, as a footballer myself, it put terrible pressure on me. You carry the thing on your shoulders all your life. You'll never be as good as your father. There was no doubt about that.
Handing over the captaincy, that was a marvellous gesture. Talk to us about it.
It was a great thing to do, of course, but I think between Conraston and Joe Barrett there was a great bond, and I don't think it would even count to my father at the time, the extra captaincy. I said what was very important was to honour Conraston. There were an awful lot of people within the Rock opposed it at the time, and he had to suffer a vote, various moves to oust him in the club, and that went on for quite a long time. That went on for decades, in actual fact.
During that time, Joe, there was a lot of political upheaval and people were on both sides. Talk to us about that, because they really knitted the county together.
Well, Tim O'Donnell told me there were times when fellas actually togged out outside the dressing room. They came in ready to play because of the atmosphere of the dressing room. I mean, it wasn't all rosy at all. It was tough enough. And Porty Lander said the same thing. He said, you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. He said it was just so tough. But fellas still did it. Fellas still went in and they joked each other, and some fellas maybe didn't joke each other, and it was cool enough at times. Johnny Welsh gave me great insight into the actual atmosphere. He was on the train going to an All-Ireland, and Conraston was in the carriage, and Johnny made a political statement. Johnny was only about 17 at the time, and he made a political statement, and Brosnan said, young fella, never speak politics on a football train, he said.
So what does it mean now, Jojo Barrett, to have been the son of a man who captained Kerry twice, looking back down through the decades now, being the actual captain?
Well, I suppose the numbers of times he captained it really doesn't really count to me that much. You know, records don't really count that much. I think the fact that he was a good man, he believed in his country, he fought for his country, he believed in his county, he played football for his county, and he died for either. That was very important to me.
Have you any memories or have you any stories about your dad coming home with the Salmon Wild Cup?
The train would pull into the station in Tralee. Joe Barrett jumped off the train at the back, went out the last carriage, and went off, crossed the fields and was down home, and he never appeared in that stuff.
In 1937, Kerry won the All-Ireland final. There was a great youth footballer from my own club, Killorglin Legion, small Timmy Leary, wonderful player. He got involved against Cavan in the All-Ireland final in 1937. Your dad was a selector. He came into the field. Tell us about that.
Strangely enough, it was the first match my mother ever saw. The first match of any sort. She had never seen a club match or anything else. My dad was on the line, and she said she was watching him. She didn't understand what was going on in the pitch, but she said she was watching him because there was something going on, and she didn't realise what it was, of course, but O'Leary was getting an awful lot of stick, and there was a guy putting the boot in, it seems. My dad was edging up along, and he had left the other selectors, and was getting the better of him anyway, and he went in and he hit Jim Smith, it seems, of Cavan, and there was a huge pile-up, and there's a great picture of Porty Landers and Michael Doyle, and a lot of the lads from the Rock, the Stacks, going in to be of assistance.
How many All-Ireland senior medals did he have, Joe?
He had 6 senior All-Ireland medals.
When your dad was in bed sick, he sent you to the wardrobe. Tell us about that.
He was only 49 at the time. And it's in fact, I'd say this was a year before he died, probably, or within the year anyway. I had never seen this little, it was in a paper bag, and then inside in a little velvet bit of cloth, and it was his collection of medals. And he said, "Get those out there, son." And I handed them to him, and it was very moving, because he went through each medal, and he obviously each match, and he tried. He tried, and he knew it was all up at that stage, and he had a stroke, and he couldn't really move an arm and a leg at the time. So it was very moving, and it made a huge impression on me for the rest of my life, really.
Series, and I'm sure that's still available, you know, it's a late record. I just want to wind up now with last Sunday's programme. They really did proud to this very period that those men and women of that great period. The 4 pages specifically on that theme in last week's programme in the Kildare-Kerry match. And this is what it reads. It says Kerry Legends in a Golden Era is the heading. Just read it a snatch. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Kerry was among the most deeply scarred counties. That's in bold print. County footballers were on opposite sides of a bitter divide, and many people believed that some Kerry players would never line out together again due to their respective allegiances during the Revolutionary period. Again in bold print. In 1924, however, a remarkable match between pro and anti-treaty players was organised to select a team to represent the county. Conbrassan got safe passage guarantees for Republican players like John Joe Sheehy and Joe Ballard to play games, and together they used football to help heal the wounds. And was that lovely? Whoever wrote that, it was very well done, this particular programme. I won't give it away because you'll never get it back. It's a collector's item. I'll finish with another poem out of Dennis Healy's collection, and as you can get that from the library. Now, imagine it gathers up what we're talking about today. It's in 1926. I don't know who wrote it now, and it was published in the Kerryman, of course, right, 1926. And that title, of course, Kerry's Gold and Green. Flash words to New York City, to Landers and Eugene, to Galvin and McKenna, our friends they have ever been. Tell them that the boys are home, their good name did redeem, when the Lily Whites were conquered in Kerry's gold and green. So they didn't forget the exiles, so your father was in that poem. Did you have that poem, Joe? No, well, I'll give you a load of it. The next verse, Pat Clifford helped Joe Barrett to hold the backward line. Brosnan, Stack and Sheehy with Russell were sublime. The forwards and the goalie, oh what a splendid team. Great followers of Dick Fitz's men in Kerry's gold and green. And that was the team that went to New York the following year. And I didn't know the full story when I was writing up about it, but thanks to Con Brosnan and Dr. Conroy, I should say here, I found out a lot more, we learned a lot more today. So I want to thank Jerome and his committee here for a marvellous idea and for getting this all together and sharing that. We can continue to share stories. There's a lot more to be shared and told. So I hand you over to Jerome. Conamina Malcolm, everybody.
We're almost there now. I neglected to say about Niall Sheehy and Brian Sheehy. Brian had been looking forward to coming, and last night he was struck down with vertigo, and he sends his sincere apologies. Now Niall was coming as well up until a fortnight ago, but his wife has got seriously ill, and his priority now is to look after his wife. We're going doing a raffle now. While Josie is getting her tickets below there, the county board, as has already been said, has commissioned a commemorative jersey from this period, and very kindly Peter Twist, who is secretary of the county board, gave us 2 tickets to raffle, or 2 jerseys to raffle, and we'll go about that now. While Josie is making her way up here, it falls to me to thank sincerely Richard McElligott. I think we get his passion for Kerry football. Richard, got a really remarkable. I also want to thank Father Tom Rooney. We get his passion as well, and we get the fact that he is an authority on Kerry G, and Dr Crooks, of course, we must mention Dr Crooks. So, Father, thank you very, very much. I want to thank the members of the families, the Barretts, Eddie and Johnny, Connor and Mike Brosnan, and Gerard Landers. I want to thank them. I think they have added immensely to the occasion and has brought history alive for us. I want to thank Aidan Clifford, who is the manager here at the CYMS. He's been an outstanding, he has cooperated immensely with us, and he's been very courteous, and he's been very busy here today now. So Aidan, for me, I want to thank the members of the Decade of Centenary Committee. Their names are there in the programme. You will see them, and they're all in the background there, walking away. And anybody will tell you that the chairman is only as good as the people around him. And it was a pleasure for me to work with these people. So thank you to them. We do the raffle now, Josie. We have two judges. Now, they won't fit any of you here present, but I'm sure you have grandchildren and you have relations. So maybe we get Father to draw there. Number 91 to 95. Good man, Mike, and Mikey down there, the staunch Milton and that more before that it was. Now so Mike, thank you very much. And the second jersey is 176 to 180. Okay. So now, before we finish, I just want to, it was mentioned there that we're going to have other projects, and can I say that on the 26th, Saturday the 26th of March, we're hosting a symposium on the Civil War, and we have some very important speakers. It's back in St. Michael's Hall at 10 o'clock from 10 to 12. So you're all welcome. It's this one is a freebie. We won't be charging at all for this one. The same whatever you paid at the door will carry you into this one as well. And on that night we're hosting the premiere of a play called Hunger Strike, written by Maureen Cregan. Now, Maureen Cregan was a native of Killorglin, and she wrote this play in 1929, and amazingly it was never ever staged. So we're going to stage it, and we have the actors are busily rehearsing at the moment, and that will be on Thursday, Friday and Saturday, the 24th, 25th, 26th of March, and the following week as well. And that will be on here to see why actually the set is set up behind the curtain there. So now it just falls to me then to thank you all very much for your attention and for attending. You have been an excellent audience, and I hope that you have enjoyed what we put on for you today. So, for me, the meeting,